Hello, FSPA students and advisors. I am advisor Courtney Hanks from University High School, where I advise the Odyssey Yearbook and the UHS Press news team. I am here today to go through the best of the best photos and show you some of my favorite selections in each category and how they are using photography to tell a story and to surprise and entertain their readers. Um, I'm going to be using some technical language here, but I also want to point out that I think a lot of this is like a gut feeling that our understanding of photography comes back to just what is, a moment that we want to be sharing in, the behind the scenes. How do we see something that maybe we normally never would have been able to see, or otherwise just a cool factor. Things like frozen water droplets, things like hairs being blown, or just a sneak peek of something that maybe we've never seen before. So technical stuff matters, it always does, but we're also going to be looking at what makes us surprised and entertained as viewers. So we're starting with Brandon Wood's photograph of a gentleman hanging from metal, ropes on this cliffy area. Now, I have no idea what's happening here, but I know I'm interested in it. It has a lot of authentic cool factor in it, even if the composition wasn't as strong as it is. But there is a lot of really good things happening in this photograph other than the cool factor. So a couple would be the color. So one of the themes you're going to be seeing in most of the photos that I've selected is that there's a really strong use of color, which in photography can be kind of a challenge because you're dealing with real life, and especially photojournalism. We don't have the ability to maybe recreate all of our settings so that way they are in a select color palette or appealing to the eye. So sometimes that comes into play a little bit when we're doing our photo editing, but a lot of the time it's just really situating yourself in the right spot to get the right photo. So using those 2 feet you got. But here we're seeing this very limited color palette. It's almost monochromatic with the black and white, but there's slight tonal changes here where we see the skin tone and the rocks with the brown tones. They're kind of bringing some warmth to an otherwise cold palette, and it works beautifully. So this photo, for a lot of different reasons, is just a nice shot, but that is also really interesting. There's this texture also of the rock itself, which has this linear pattern that with the lines of the ropes and the shadows of the ropes or chains, I guess it's what we call. Those things all come together, and they are, leading us into different areas of the photograph, and just structurally are very interesting on their own. So coming together into this shot beautifully. We've got texture, that palette, the selected palette with the monochromatic tones. He's also in rule of thirds. His hand is also creating a leading line. There's just, it's excellent, guys. I think this is one of our very best photos that we had in our selections. Another beautiful use of color is seen here by Anna Wesley. We have the florals of her dress being kind of echoed in this green background with also these little tiny flowers. This is that limited color palette. We have the coolness of the greens and blues complementing the warmth of the skin. So it's just a very beautiful color arrangement to begin with. And then on top of that, we have things like the texture of the background, which is really creates this repetition for us. The unexpected surprise of her being flipped upside down. Just a wonderful, beautiful portrait. This is an interesting shot. So coming back to cool factor, you're at night, which is a hard enough situation to photograph in, but we're seeing a lot of really interesting things happening here. The light and the color are once again being used beautifully. We have the red light and the green light framing our subject in the very center of the composition, which in the first photo we were talking about rule of thirds and how the subject fell on that rule of thirds line. Here we're seeing a centered subject and how that sense of symmetry and balance is also a really interesting way to frame your subject. So you don't always have to shoot in rule of thirds. Centered can also be a really interesting way to highlight your subject and to draw attention to them, especially when you're talking about a setting like this where there's obvious depth on both sides of the subject and lots of leading lines with the streets and the light posts. It's just it all flows and it's got lots of movement and color, and it's a very interesting shot. Here we have a photo illustration. So this is going to be an edited actual photo, and you can see how in this instance, color is being brought into the photograph to create the illustration. So purposeful use of color, lots of warm tones with cool tones that are all complementary. Here's another photo illustration, so an edited, digitally manipulated photograph. And this one is mostly, it's just really interesting how the photographer took the original photo and blended it in, and oops, I keep doing that, and brought it into, it just goes back to the beginning, trying to hit that button, to the photograph, and the final photograph comes together really beautifully. It does look like a natural reflection, so it's just an interesting way of using digital manipulation. I want to talk about a lot of things with this photograph. Once again, we're talking about being a photographer. You don't get to choose everything that happens. You don't get to, it's not like being an artist where you can paint you know, a subject in and make the colors, make everything that's going to happen, because you get to make all those choices. In photography, a lot of it's being in the right place at the right time. And that's where this photographer is. They're in the right place at the right time. They have the right technical skills to get this shot in, the proper exposure. We have a blurred background, so the aperture is wide enough that we are seeing our subjects in focus, and a background that is non-distracting. Both the player and the coach have expressions that tell a story. And then finally, what I really love about this is that it is close. When you're talking about a big emotion, we want to see a really tight shot, so nice and close to their faces. It really just takes the photography to the next level and brings out the emotion. It allows us to feel in the intensity of the moment, which is really important if you're talking about photography and emotion and how we want to try to stimulate that in our viewers. So very successful recreation of that emotion, seeing even just the eyelashes and how they're curled, all that detail is really bringing in the anguish that this player is experiencing. All right, this seems more like a moment of celebration to me, although he is grimacing, but also great emotion, nice and tight. The photographer isn't standing a million feet away, and if he is, he's using a fantastic lens that is getting us nice and tight to the subject. Great execution of the actual exposure. A nice angle coming at it from right at the elbow instead of coming at it from too high or too low. And then even in the cropping, we're seeing that we are selecting to keep the celebratory gentleman in the back left-hand corner here, which also gives more insight. I always try to say that, like, when we do include backgrounds, so when there's something other than the subject in the photo, we want to try to be as purposeful as possible. How can we use the surroundings to give context? And the fact that this guy is smiling tells me they're celebrating, and that gives me more information, so that way I can understand the image. I chose this one because when you are looking at crowd shots, a lot of times my students will go and they'll just take photos of big crowds. And yes, I want to see all those wonderful smiling faces at a game, but it is so incredibly important to have a subject. No matter how many people are there, no matter what is happening, we want to see one person and know where our eye is supposed to go. And that's true for design just as much as it is for photography. So how are we connecting the viewer to what they should be looking at? What are we using for a strategy? And here we have this guy in this blue shirt with his arms raised. He's creating his own space and dominance within this image, and it is working. So we have a celebratory young man that becomes our subject and really tells a part of this narrative and gives us a place to land our eye. Right, another example of a crowd, but a person being in front of that crowd. Also want to note that the background is blurred here. So when we create that effect with our shooting and our cameras, we are allowing the subject to stand out while still providing the context of where they are. So we get to see the crowd, we know they exist, especially when you're in the gym, you've got people everywhere. If you don't do something like blur the background or get really close, you're going to lose your subject, and it's going to be very difficult to tell what the story is. Okay. just another storytelling image. I'm really interested in what's happening here. The photographer is kind of creating this space where the subject is framed. We get the story of not just her posing with her dress, but also the story of the photographer and her and the setting. And it's just a nicely well-designed composition. This one's interesting. This is one of my students, and when she came to me, she said, I think I have a really good shot. I'm kind of nervous to show it to you because I don't know. And when we looked at it together, I'm like, oh, this is great. And it's just an interesting usage of light. So the student in this photograph was photographing an art sculpture she did in her art class, and just the way that the classroom was dark, the phone was bright, just her focus on the project at hand, all of it came together to create this tiny little moment. And it's interesting all on its own. We're interested in what she's doing, and that's good photojournalism. It gets us interested in the story of the photograph. Here's another photograph. There's a lot of things working well here. First, where are we in the shot? You know, students every year will paint these spaces. This was our first year with the painting of spaces, but when the photographer got in there, she didn't just shoot from above and get a bunch of tops of heads. She made sure she got down to their level. She spent time there. You can tell the subject was comfortable with the photographer taking this photo. So if you just pop into, you know, for a few minutes, and you're not giving yourself the time to kind of acquaint yourself with the people in the space, especially with senior painting, like this, there's only a handful of kids here at a time. They're going to notice the photographer. You know, coming in, getting acquainted, spending this time. It makes it so that the photographer has the ability to capture these really interesting and beautiful moments. It was a cloudy, overcast day, which created this almost selective background. But notice that the photographer chose this spot. You know, if they were 2 feet over to the left, there's a chance that the subject would have had behind them a bunch of different cars, and they would have been more distracting. But we have this one moment, centered subject. Even her line of her leg is leading us into her face. It's, you know, her whole body is creating this flow through the image. It's a really interesting shot. Great use of color, great use of selective background with blur. There's emotion in it. There's the wind in her hair, the detail of that, and it comes together to create a beautiful image. All right, and just using that photograph to tell a story. We also have what I call here, well, I don't call it, everybody calls it. It's called depth. All right, and depth is really, really important in your photography. If you're trying to get your photos to stop being boring or flat, learning about foreground, middle ground, background, and starting to try to think in terms of that every single time you're out taking photographs, you will be a better photographer. You can see here we have the guy holding the string in the foreground. So he creates this sense of depth by giving us the ability to understand the space. The guy in the center who's eating the donut becomes the middle ground, and he is clearly our subject. So he is framed by the guy in the foreground. And then in the background, this student is now giving us that additional sense of depth. So it's like creating the illusion of space, and it really heightens the photograph's ability to tell a story. So they're better shots when you have more depth. And I know I personally see my photography grow a lot since I started thinking in terms of depth and framing. Another thing to be thinking about is, where are you taking your photographs? You know, every, kid knows what your inside of your school looks like. Finding time to go and explore with the kids who are not on campus and what they are up to is a great opportunity for shots. My kids love going to the beach with the Earth and Surf teams. And I'm sorry, I probably shouldn't be saying my kids, but those are some of my students, and they love going to the beach with the Earth and Surf team. Even though it's an extra, 30 minutes away from us, it allows us to capture these really interesting moments that just provide a different angle to the student life that we don't typically get to capture. So we get to see emotion in the shot. We get to see storytelling with the kids doing cleanup. But it's also just nice to have that break of everything being on the school campus. Kids are involved in lots of things. Find those opportunities to go out there and find those moments. All right, and we all have to shoot the, pep rallies. We all have to shoot at, and all these gym, photos, which our gym is wildly dark. But when you're in these moments, can you find little vignettes, tiny stories that mean something? Here's a freshman student who was on the cheer team. She's sitting there, she's saying, while the anthem's being sung, and you can see the band behind her playing it. It's all, coming together to tell a story. The colors are nice. The lighting is as good as it's going to be, but it is a nice story, I guess. And that's what we're looking for in photojournalism. And here we have nice sense of symmetry. Like, look at the way that the guy in the middle creates a triangle that comes out. Anytime you can look at geometry, so you can put a rectangle, a triangle. I always say odd, so like triangle's the best. So, so rectangle has 4, dots. We would have 3 in a triangle, 3 sides. That's going to allow us to create a really interesting composition. So here we see that triangle appearing, foreground, middle ground, background. There's emotion, there's anguish, there's stress, there's fury, there's grass, there's Club Olympics happening. So we have all these different moments coming together. We're telling a story, but also just the composition is really strong with symmetry and that use of geometry. And depth, yeah. So always come back to foreground, middle ground, background. And that's my presentation, y'all. So hopefully you guys learned a little bit of something about some of the amazing photography that came through for our submissions this year. I hope everybody is doing well and that you are all safe. And if you have any questions for me, you can always shoot me an email. Yeah, so bye.